That's obviously not desirable. And then you might think, well, what's the alternative to a tyranny? And you might say, well, direct democracy, where the voice of the people rules supreme and the leader must follow the whims of the crowd. But the problem with that is that it's not that easy to figure out what the crowd thinks, and the entire system can fall prey to suddenly arising, poorly organized, deviant impulses. And so what the founders of the American state did, and many other states as well, is set up a series of intermediary structures of power, let's say, and so you could sort of list them up hierarchically. There would be the domain of responsibility of the individual. There'd be the domain of the responsibility of the married couple, of the family, of the local community, then the town, then the state or province, and then the country. And then each of those levels would be requested to take as much responsibility for what they could at the local level. And the relationship between all those levels should be governed by the principle that if it can be decided at a lower level, then it should be. And the reason that that's useful is twofold. One is that it's a really good way of delegating responsibility. It's very efficient if everyone plays their role. The second is, and this is another thing the Conservatives really have on their side. If the state does everything for you, let's say, well, in a sense, you're secure, although you're not, because you're beholden to the benevolence of the state, and that can be taken away arbitrarily. But the downside is, this is one of the downsides of universal basic income proposals, is like, well, what the hell is there left for you to do? If the state does everything for you, well, you're secure, but what's your life then? You have no purpose. And if the purpose of life, and this is another thing that the more libertarian conservatives could be offering, is like, imagine that the purpose of your life isn't security and satiation, because you're not just an overgrown infant. Imagine instead that the purpose of your life is something like responsible, productive, generous adventure. And then the call would be, make space for people to manifest that in the particularities of their own life. And then everyone has a real part to play, and no one in some real sense is subordinate to anyone else. Like there'd be a hierarchical structure, and some people like you would be leading at the more abstract levels. But your power would be, or your authority and your responsibility would be properly delimited. And everything else everybody else was doing all the way down the hierarchy, right to the level of running their individual enterprise, would in some sense be just as meaningful and just as crucial. And that strikes me as an extraordinarily useful vision of governance, especially in the aftermath of the COVID fiasco.
And it's interesting because that's something that you're right. The Conservatives in Canada have not exploited as much as they could, because philosophically, we want power to be the closest to the citizen as possible. We're supposed to be the party of decentralization, and especially with the Quebec question. The Conservatives should be the party that is the closest to the Quebec aspiration traditionally, because one of the big problem in Canada was the one-size-fits-all from Ottawa. And it didn't fit in Quebec because we were different in many aspects for all sorts of linguistic, historical reasons. And so many Conservatives that I know in Ottawa are the most decentralist politicians of them all on the national stage. But unfortunately, Conservatives it's never been a stronghold for conservatism in Quebec. Not for like a century, but it should be the opposite. And when you were talking about Alberta earlier on, because where you're from originally, the Alberta after Quebec is the most decentralist province in Canada. And we should be the strongest allies. But as you said, we're often at the on opposite sides because for all sorts of other reasons. But philosophically, in terms of decentralization and power vis-a-vis citizen, we're the ones who share the similar view. And we should always be on the same side, and we should not be a centralist and look at Ottawa and think that they know best. And that's what I'm trying to propose as well. I think it will be important if we can have a real conservative party in Quebec at the provincial level. And it's important because Quebecers, unlike other Canadians, we do identify ourselves first and foremost to our provincial government more than the federal. You know, the federal, it's like having, you know, our nationality is Quebec and our passport is Canadian. So that's how we define ourselves. And so the most important government for us is our provincial government because, you know, all the main things, education, healthcare, and all sorts of things, it's provincial. The federal government is managing things that are very far away from us, international relations and the army and Canada Post, but that's how we see it. Like, so our sense of community is related to the provincial government. And in Alberta, after Quebec, it's the province where they have that as high as we do. There's a strong sentiment of Alberta first. And so if we have a true conservative movement in Quebec that could last, not just for an election, but for a generation or two, I think we're going to see new alliances between conservatives in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada, and it could have a huge impact on the federal level. And as you said, the dominant party historically has been the Liberals, but if we're able to switch Quebec, which has always been one of the reasons why the Liberals were much more in power than the Conservatives, because the French Canadian Catholics used to vote more for the Liberals. Historically, it was more the Catholics were voting more liberal, and if that shifts, and if the decentralists start to link together in Canada, and those who want to have the power closest to them, the subsidiarity, as you talked about, then we're going to reshape not just Quebec politics, but Canadian politics altogether.
Well, you could imagine a vision that made the case that Quebec has maintained its distinct and valuable culture, particularly reflected, I would say, in Montreal, although Quebec City is also quite a remarkable place, and I don't know rural Quebec as well, that it's the principle of local autonomy that in some sense has made that possible, and that actually what's trying to be protected in some real sense is that local autonomy, which would be the special flavor of, well, the small business community in Quebec and the services that it manages, and the street life and the festivals and the food culture and the joie de vivre, which is definitely present in Montreal, and the safety of the streets. There's a lot of value in that local culture. And what Quebecois presumed for the longest time, and maybe with some justification, was that it was necessary to centralize under a powerful provincial government and a nationalist movement to ensure autonomy on the cultural side. But you could make a strong case, I think, and this is the case that you're outlining, that no,